using the Real ACT Prep Guide, Introduction to Math. Basically, the ACT math test is different from the SAT math test in that it is more difficult, and you have more questions, a little more questions, and again, time limit is important because you are more limited in time than the SAT, and it's more difficult because instead of going up to geometry, or like algebra 2, it actually goes up to trig. So the ACT math is different in that it has more sections. So there's pre-algebra, elementary algebra, intermediate algebra, coordinate geometry, plane geometry, and trig. And the extra part would be trig, which is not found on the SAT, so that makes it more difficult. And you have 60 minutes to answer 60 questions, but it's different from the SAT math in that it is more straightforward. So they won't give you trick questions. It's more like, how would you solve this equation? Rather than, okay, if in terms of equations, ACT would be like, here's the equation, solve it. SAT would be like, how do you write this out as an equation and then solve it? Even though the equation is more simple, it's difficult because you have to actually do everything yourself and there's more thinking involved. The types of questions would be basic math questions. Basic math questions are, for example, like this. What is 4% of 1,100? And this is just multiplying them together. It's very straightforward. And then there's also harder questions. So for example, when you go away from basic, there will be basic math problems in settings. For example, these will be like word problems. So what is the total cost of 2.5 pounds of bananas at 0.34 per pound and 2.5 pounds of tomatoes at 0.66 per pound? Just kind of multiply them out and add them together. So it's still very straightforward because it's basically just simple equations and simple algebra. It's just that the main problem with ACT math is that your time is limited. You will have to go faster, but that's pretty much it. Everything else is very similar. And then there's a few very challenging problems, and most of them will be very intermediate or like basic problems. There are very few challenging problems, and those are used to determine like a 36 from like a 34. So if you get those kind of questions, they're not tricky, they're just difficult to solve because you might have to work with difficult numbers. And on the SAT, you really don't need calculators, but on the ACT, you might need calculators because some of the numbers that they give you are difficult to solve in your head. Whereas the SAT is kind of technique over actual solving questions. So, for example, these are questions that are harder because you have to actually think about them a little. Basically, that is the math section. It's kind of self-explanatory. It's been pretty much, ACT math is pretty much the same as SAT math. It's just that there is trig, which is not found on the SAT math. And I hope this helped and do well on the test.